Hello and welcome to another video getting you the very top grades. I hope you're going to find this one really useful because many of you will be thinking, I know enough to get a grade 7, but I'm just not getting it in my essay writing. So I'm going to teach you the 5 most common problems which are stopping you from getting the grade 7. Number 1, you are starting with the extract. Now this is an extract on setting in Jekyll and Hyde, and it doesn't matter if you haven't read that book, okay? You will still understand my points here. That's the length of the extract. I'm not even going to read it with you. The key thing is this. Starting with the extract, how does Stephenson use setting throughout the novel? Now, there is a massive issue here. The examiners tell you to start with the extract. But, newsflash, they don't care whether you start with the extract or not. This is the examiners trying to give you something to write about, because everybody in the country has to do this question, even if they're not good at English at all. And this is the examiner's way of giving students something to quote. You know, well, at least I've got something to write about. Thank you, examiner. You've given me an extract. But an unintended consequence of this is that you don't write very well about the novel as a whole. The other unintended consequence of it is that you just start zooming in on what's in the extract and you don't really focus on the writer's intentions. So actually starting with the extract really limits your thinking, and I'm going to encourage you to start with the novel as a whole. So when I get the exam question, I don't read the extract. I know that sounds bizarre. Follow me here. I don't read the extract because I look at the question and think, okay, why does Stephenson pay so much attention to the setting? And what can I say about that? Right, my next tactic is to spend no more than 3 minutes writing a plan. And my plan just involves me writing down notes about anything I can think of connected to the setting and why the writer includes that setting. So I'm going to think of the back of Jekyll's house, because that's where Hyde comes in, and it will allow me to explore the duality of man, Jekyll's respectability at the front, Hyde's disrespectable, for want of a better word, Hyde's immoral entrance at the back. I'm then going to think about Hyde choosing to live in Soho. Although that seems quite far away in the novel, a reader with a knowledge of London would know that it's just 5 minutes walk away from Leicester Square where Jekyll lives, and this means the respectable Leicester Square is deliberately placed, juxtaposed, contrasted to the den of iniquity that is Soho, and the readers would understand from that juxtaposition that this again is the duality of man, the division between the respectable and the criminal is not that great, and gentlemen in Victorian London practiced their sins in Soho while living right next door to Leicester Square, which is symbolic for their hypocrisy of middle-class men. I remember that Dr. Lanyon lives in Cavendish Square, a little further away from Soho, and Utterson describes his square as a citadel. And now a citadel is a walled city defending itself against outside invaders. So I'll be able, if I choose, to write about the middle class barricade against sin that we might expect the readers to share. How they're trying to barricade themselves against the threat of crime, which is represented by Hyde, and the Christian crime of immorality, which is represented by Jekyll and his immoral experiments from a Christian perspective, his immoral experiments to bring about this character of Hyde, who is supposed to be, in Jekyll's words, pure evil. I can also look at the many descriptions of the nocturnal lamp-lighted city of Utterson's nightmare. It opens with a description of Hyde trampling over this girl at night, and Utterson has this nightmare where he imagines the girl being trampled everywhere, and then he imagines Jekyll's bed. So we can look at the symbolism of this and decide that Utterson's sleep is being disturbed by this undercurrent of immorality and sinfulness in middle-class men. We can also look at how the nighttime city is lamplighted as a symbol of how so many gentlemen are out enjoying things that they shouldn't be enjoying at night, such as drug taking, drinking, prostitution, gambling, whatever it is. It's unnamed in the novel. Similarly, we can link this to the fact that the novel starts with Enfield confessing that he's been out at 3 a.m. in the morning, just like Hyde has, and it therefore invites us to imagine, through this setting, that many such gentlemen are out exploring their own dual natures and their evil, sinful desires, if we take the Christian perspective. We can also see the fascination that he has with Jekyll's bed. I'm not going to labour this point here, but if you look through my videos, you'll see how there's a lot of sexual imagery here, which suggests that Utterson's interest in Jekyll is actually one of homosexual desire, which he has to repress, and therefore the setting conveys how Victorian society has had to repress this desire for homosexual relationships. Now, you don't have to have that analysis, but it's there if you want it. I've talked about the nighttime setting with Enfield. We also have a moonlight murder of Sir Danvers Carew. So the moonlight setting gives us a kind of Gothic tradition that Stephenson is entering into. And this Gothic setting is important to his readers. It's there because that's the kind of genre they're interested in reading. It also leads us to the idea of evil, perhaps, at moonlight, which is where Hyde comes in. So he's thematically connected with evil. But there's more going on here. Sir Danvers Carew is killed by the river, which is really close to the Houses of Parliament, and obviously he represents the Houses of Parliament. He's a member of Parliament, and this strongly suggests that this setting is chosen to show that even the most powerful in the land are the potential victims of crime. However, we could go further and say that even the most powerful in the land are still out and about, wandering at night, perhaps servicing their immoral desires, and therefore Sir Danvers Carew is just as much a hypocrite as Jekyll and as Enfield, and Stephenson could be arguing that even the most respectable men who are making our laws are actually behaving immorally in their own time. So this is a way of portraying the corruption in society at the same time as portraying Hyde as irredeemably evil and needing to be punished at the end of the novel. You will also know, I hope, that Jekyll's house and the description of it is based exactly on the John Hunter house. And John Hunter was a famous surgeon of the late 1700s who made huge advances in medicine, but the only way he could do that was by having dead bodies exhumed illegally. He paid body snatchers to bring corpses into his medical theatre so that he could dissect them in front of his students and teach them about surgery and how the body works. So here we have a really close parallel with Jekyll, because they're both engaged in really profound scientific discovery. John Hunter led to huge medical advances, but he did it through social transgression. He did it through committing illegal acts, which nevertheless led to him being celebrated. So in Leicester Square there were, I think, up to 5 statues of John Hunter, I think I read. They're not there now, but he became a famous figure and much praised for the advances in science. That obviously is what Jekyll wanted, and Stephenson could be pointing out that Jekyll is not necessarily an irredeemably evil character. He's only doing what surgeons have done before. So we can use that setting to perhaps suggest that Stephenson is in favour of the kind of scientific discovery that Jekyll was trying to embark on, rather than presenting it purely as this kind of moral story which teaches that you shouldn't meddle with nature through the intervention of science. John Hunter's intervention proved crucial in building life expectancy in the Victorians. Now, I also know some autobiographical details. So Stephenson himself wrote this book while he was in Bournemouth, convalescing from lung disease. He had tuberculosis. But he didn't really choose to live in London. He avoided London like the plague. And not long after writing the novel, he actually fled Britain entirely and went to Samoa. Now, this is a fascinating detail in his history because Samoa at that time was a non-Christian setting, a pagan setting. Ultimately, they did all get converted to Christianity, and the Pacific Islands are now very Christian places. But in Stephenson's time, part of the attraction was in fleeing the Christian morality of London and also the hypocrisy of London. And therefore, we can talk about why he set the novel in London itself, because it highlights the hypocrisy of the centre of power. That's where the Houses of Parliament is. That's where the rich businessmen, the rich middle classes live, the people who control society. And he's arguing that all of them are potentially just as immoral as Jekyll. And therefore, once we've argued that he rejects the Christian morality of the book, we also have to argue that he can't afford to do that openly because most of his readers are Christian, and therefore he promotes a Christian context to the novel. So there are many references to God and Satan to prove to the reader that this is a battle between religious good and evil, and the evil is eventually punished. However, closer reading of Utterson's geography will be that he lives conveniently close to a church. When you look at that description, it sounds like he's positioned himself there just so that going to church is going to be no effort. It's just part of his facade to look respectable. He's playing by society's rules, but he's not really interested in it. And then there's this humorous description of him reading a dry divinity before he goes to sleep at night. In other words, he picks up any religious book, a Christian one, a divinity. He makes sure it's as dry as possible, as boring as possible, because it sends him to sleep. So this is an amusing way in which Stephenson makes fun of the Christian setting of the novel, but it's coded, if you like. It's one that his Christian readers won't necessarily pick up on as criticism of Christianity. They'll see it as a slight criticism of Utterson's piety and his faith. Now, obviously, that's much more than 3 minutes worth of explanation, but in the exam, I'm just bashing out these ideas as quick as possible. I'm not having to put any bits of explanation in because the plan is just for me. And I'm not expecting you to get 10 ideas down. Of course, you don't need that many. But obviously, in my 3 minutes, I can get there. How many do I need in an essay? Well, 4 or 5 would be plenty. You've got plenty of ideas with 4 or 5 to choose from to write your essay. Well, what next? I've numbered these almost at random in the order that I thought them through. However, now your job, having written these, is to think, well, how am I going to put this in an order that will best present my argument? And then you just number them accordingly. So they won't appear in that order, they'll appear in the order in which you want to write. But remember, this is 3 minutes of your thinking. It's not you spending ages thinking, because you don't get marks for your thoughts. You only get marks for what you write in the essay. Right, only then will I bother to read the extract. Well, when I read the first paragraph, none of it links to any of my ideas. So what am I going to do? I'm going to ignore it. I'm not interested in that paragraph. It's got nothing in that links to my ideas. Move on. Even on Sunday, when it's veiled its more florid charms and lay comparatively empty of passage, the street shone out in contrast to its dingy neighbourhood. Well, I can link that to respectability and lack of respectability. I might have that. Like a fire in a forest, and with its freshly painted shutters, well-polished brasses, and general cleanliness and gaiety of tone, instantly caught and pleased the eye of the passenger. Well, I can link that to the idea of respectability, that false front, the facade that Jekyll puts on, but it doesn't really grab me, so I'll use it if I have to. 2 doors from one corner, on the left hand going east, The line was broken by the entry of a court, and just at that point a certain sinister block of building thrust forward its gable on the street. It was 2 stories high, showed no window, nothing but a door on the lower story and a blind forehead of discoloured wall on the upper, and bore in every feature the marks of prolonged and sordid negligence. Okay, at last I've got something to write about. Here I've got the description of Jekyll's entrance to the house. We can talk about the personification here and how that personifies Jekyll, perhaps as blind to morality and Christian behaviour. And we can talk about the sordid negligence of his behaviour. So the house represents him, but remember, Hyde also represents the dual nature of Jekyll. Okay? So now I've got something to say about the setting which links to what I wanted to talk about. From that one quotation, I can go back to write about Jekyll's house being respectable on the front. I can talk about how Hyde also has this residence in Soho, and I can talk about the John Hunter house. So there's 3 things in my plan that I can link to from that one quotation. Brilliant. Because what that means is I'm no longer getting bogged down in the extract. I'm using the extract to back up the ideas I've already planned. The door, which was equipped with neither bell nor knocker, was blistered and distained. Tramps slouched in the recess and struck matches on the panels. Children kept shop upon the steps. The schoolboy had tried his knife on the mouldings, and for close on a generation no one had appeared to drive away these random visitors or to repair their ravages. Well, I can pick on lots of details in there to show that the state of London is in decline. There's been a whole generation where people have stopped moving these tramps and immoral people on. I can link it to the idea of men being at root evil like Hyde is, and link that to the schoolboy and his knife vandalising the property. And I could, if I wanted, talk about the door being blistered as a representation of Hyde's morality. And that's enough. You know, I've got plenty of ideas there. The examiners don't care how many things I pick out from the extract. I'll repeat, the extract is only there to help you get started. Right, I'm now going to show you a student essay where the student's easily capable of getting a grade 7, which you can see from their knowledge of the text, but the way they've organised the essay shows you the pitfalls of first starting with the extract, secondly not planning what they wanted to argue for the novel as a whole, and then the 4th thing I want to show you is how they've got locked into this idea that GCSE AQA examiners really recommend, which is writing a lot about a little. But in this question, this type of essay, that causes you big problems, and I'm going to illustrate that as well from the essay. Let's go and take a look. In the novella A Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Stephenson uses settings as a tool to explore the duality and inner darkness ever present in humanity. Now, I tell all my students to write a thesis, which is your argument, and this is a really strong thesis. Stephenson does this in order to exploit the hypocrisy of Victorian society, suggesting that we all conceal a hidden darkness behind the superficial, reputable image being presented to the world. There's a second part to the thesis. So automatically the examiner is thinking, this is a student who really understands the novel, he's got some really interesting things to say about the author's purpose, I'm going to give this at least a grade 7. There are some first impressions that are going to cause a problem. So novella here has a capital, and the title of the novel has been misrepresented very slightly because it's The Strange Case and not A Strange Case. There's nothing in the mark scheme that would cause me to mark that down, but it does place a doubt in the examiner's mind that you're not fully in control of your writing. Right, let's look at this bit here. The book first being published in 1866 at a time when the church and therefore Christianity ruled and high moral values were upheld. Well, that's an interesting point of context, but it's not related at all to what you're arguing and therefore doesn't score you any marks. It just feels a bit clunky. It's not there to build your argument. Okay, our student now launches into proving their argument. Stephenson highlights the duality that resides within humanity by using the diverse setting of London. Very good. More marks if you've got quotation marks around duality. On one street, you could have inhabitants that were doing well, and yet within the close proximity, there were dingy neighbourhoods which bore the hallmarks of sordid negligence. Well, true, lots of embedded quotations here, but you're not linking this to the author's argument. Let's see what happens here. It was often common that Victorian gentlemen would partake of surreptitious sexual behaviour in poorer areas of London before returning to their standing in society. This is perhaps indicative of the inclination of the Victorian society to conceal their dark behaviour by carrying this out in dingy streets in order to preserve their reputation. Well, also true, very well written, great vocabulary, but you're not linking it to the author's purpose here. But if we go back to my 3-minute plan, you could see that I could link that to Hyde's address in Soho and the nocturnal lamplighted city that Utterson Nightmare is in, and also Utterson first encountering Hyde at night. Now, the advantage of doing that is I can start to say that Stephenson has this as a plan throughout the novel. He's using this symbolism everywhere in order to make his point. But the problem with starting with the extract is I'm no longer arguing about Stevenson's viewpoint here, and I'm not linking it to what he's doing elsewhere in the novel, so I'm not really being very convincing about the kind of world he's trying to describe and change. So saying that he just describes Victorian society in a particular way is good, but we really need to link it to why he describes it and how he wants the readers to change their behaviour or change their perception about what is and isn't reputable. Let's look at the next paragraph. The imagery created by sordid negligence, great embedded quotation, suggests that the houses were not well maintained and abandoned by society. This is symbolic of how the concealed, immoral and abhorrent actions of typical Victorian gentlemen had ruined and stained society. Well, you see, this is a bit of a stretch, isn't it? I've just got a phrase here and I'm saying that's typical of the whole of Victorian society and Victorian gentlemen. Actually, that's true, but I haven't built the case for it. I've just picked on some words in the extract. But with my 3-minute plan, there are any number of other things I can link it to in the novel as a whole, and therefore show that the whole novel is constructed in order to portray Victorian gentlemen as hypocrites. And so I might link straight away to the Houses of Parliament being near to where Sir Danvers Carew was killed, for example. Or I can link to the Soho address of Hyde again, or to Enfield's escapades as he's out visiting the ends of the earth, as he put it, or the ends of the world. Now, there is another little thing I've highlighted here that does get inside the examiner's mind, and that is whenever there's the word this, it's usually the start of a sentence. You need a full stop, and it really does drive English teachers bananas, and your examiner will be an English teacher. Do not leave the full stop leave the full stop out or put a comma there. Get that right. Here we go again. The novella was written in a time when high Christian values were upheld. However, hidden sin was still rife within the community. Stephenson perhaps warns the reader of the slippery slope into moral degradation which occurs by continuing the life of duality. Well, I'm starting to get the marks now because I'm linking it to Stevenson's purpose. I've got a slight issue here in that I've introduced quotation marks round slippery slope. You do that because you realise you're using language that isn't formal, but it's best not to use that language at all. So could easily have written that the society is becoming morally degraded. So use the vocabulary you already have and it'll be much more formal. Okay, you'll have noticed that all the quotations so far have come entirely from the passage, and so far this student has made no connections with the rest of the novel. And yet there are at least 10 interesting ideas this student could go back to in the rest of the novel. Well, this is where we have the danger of writing a lot about a little, because this student is still now focused on the extract and trying to make really profound points about the quotations they find just in that extract. Stephenson uses setting to provide the first introduction into the dark and sinister side of Mr. Hyde when he describes what is later known to be the house of Mr. Hyde as the door which was equipped with neither bell nor knocker was blistered and distained, with this not being normal for a door, just as Hyde was to be abnormal. So it's slightly clumsily phrased, but the idea is there that the door represents Hyde's abnormality, but it's not really linked to a proper purpose. It's just saying that Stephenson is creating a sinister figure in Hyde. Well, that's a bit obvious, isn't it? What we want to know is why he's created this sinister figure. What is his point about society? How does he want society to change? Now, once you get into those discussions, then you're putting forward an argument. And if we go back to the 3-minute plan, do you remember I told you to number the sequence in the order in which you'd put it in order to build an argument? Remember the thesis that the student wrote at the beginning of the essay. It was a really good one. There were 2 parts to the argument. But now this student needs to train themselves always to come back to the points they were making in that thesis. That's what the argument is trying to prove. But instead, by going back to the extract all the time, the student has lost track of their brilliant argument, and they're just thinking, under pressure in the exam, oh my God, what quotations can I find to show why the setting's important? So another exam tactic that will help you avoid that, apart from the 3-minute plan, is to start ticking off every time you write about one, tick it off so that you know which ones are left. And they're going to form the most important points as you build towards the end of your argument. Now, writing a lot about a little has led him into even more trouble because he's going to write a whole other paragraph about that same quotation. The lack of knocker or bell would also be indicative of the fact that there was to be no admission to outsiders. And as the novella unfolds, the lack of a knocker symbolises the way in which Jekyll becomes isolated from his friend. They have no access to him as the darkness and power of Mr. Hyde within him grows. Well, fine, but so what? What's that got to do with the point of view that Stephenson is trying to get over, and what's it got to do with your thesis? At the minute, it doesn't have anything to do with those things. It therefore becomes a random, well-written point in your essay. Now, another problem with writing a lot about a little, and there we are, he's going to write about blistered now in the same quotation, is that it forces you to invent some kind of symbolic reason for everything to be there, because you know that writing about symbolism is going to get you more marks. Well, it is, and therefore you want to pick the symbolism that comes elsewhere in the novel, that's in your 3-minute plan, not in the extract, where you're really going to have to overanalyze things in too much detail. Let's have a look. The use of the word blistered would suggest some sort of illness that was to reside within Hyde. During Victorian times, those who suffered from illness were often shunned by society, looked upon with disdain. In contrast, the other houses which also occupy the street with Jekyll's house are described as handsome houses, and the front hall of Jekyll's house is described as the most pleasant room in London. Stephenson does this to build up an imagery in the reader's mind of how both Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde are 2 different spectrums of the social scale. Well, the problem here is by finding so much in just one word, you end up by contradicting the thesis here. So you've said that there are 2 different spectrums of the social scale. Well, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde are actually both gentlemen. They're at the same end of the social scale. So that's not really what you mean. And starting with the novel would show how they are both gentlemen of the same rank of the social scale. Let me show you. You've got the imagery of the house. You've got the juxtaposition of Soho and Leicester Square. You've got Jekyll's bed which Utterson imagines Hyde standing next to. You've got Enfield spotting Hyde, going into Jekyll's house and coming out with a cheque. In other words, Hyde is a gentleman and he represents the evil desires, the sinful lusts and passions of Victorian gentlemen. And that, of course, was the point of part of your thesis. Stephenson does this in order to exploit the hypocrisy of Victorian society, suggesting that we all conceal hidden darkness. Yeah, so the point wasn't about social division and different classes. The point was that all the middle class were like this. All respectable citizens are potentially hypocrites in this society. I'll qualify that slightly because the description is mainly of Victorian men. So it's the male citizens who exhibit power who are hypocrites. Okay, in the next paragraph, the student has realised that they need to write about the rest of the novel, and it feels as though they've semi-memorised some points that they want to put into the essay. Each paragraph is going to contain a well-argued point, but the problem is it feels random in the essay. They don't necessarily belong in this part of the essay, whereas the numbering in your 3-minute plan is going to teach you to plan the order so you build your argument, so there will be no random paragraphs. However, when things begin to take a sinister twist in the plot, the aura of the area is described in a completely different light. When Utterson is making his way to Jekyll's house, Stephenson uses pathetic fallacy to navigate the reader's emotions to the change in setting, with the weather being described as wild and cold, of the most diaphanous and lawny texture, and the wind flecked blood into the face. Well, you've got 3 quotations there. You really need to write about how they influence the reader's thinking in the way that you think Stephenson wants to influence them. It's not enough to say it's changing the tone or affecting the reader's emotions. It's got to be linked to Stevenson's points that you raised in your thesis. The weather is described as wild and is suggestive of Hyde's animal-like and unpredictable nature. True. The house, which was once the pleasantest in London, has become plunged in darkness. The metaphor for the light in Jekyll's home is an analogy with the light of goodness that used to be within the man. Good, but again, what is Stevenson's point in doing that? What is he trying to show about Victorian gentlemen? Well, the next paragraph looks like it might tell us. Let's have a look. Stevenson uses darkness throughout the novella to show the frailty of light, which often connotes good angelic forces, which would have been clear to the Victorian reader, with Christianity being the ruling force at the time. Light and dark, sickness and health, life and death are binary oppositions used throughout the novel to parallel the goodness and evil at war with the individual. Well, that's great. It all feels memorised, but it's not linked to his purpose. Yes, he's got all these contrasts in there, but why? What is he trying to make the reader understand? And so, because you put so many ideas in one sentence, you don't develop your point that light is frail, and therefore presumably that evil will triumph in the war you mention. So there's the war here. Why would Stephenson be trying to show that evil is going to triumph? Is that because it simply plays into the Christian morality of most of his readers, or does he actually believe it? Does he think that progress in science is destroying Christian belief and leading to a more immoral society? Or is it that he thinks the hypocrisy of this Christian society actually allows evil to thrive, and he's had enough of this society and is actually going to leave for Samoa, thank you very much, and he's not interested in Britain anymore? It doesn't matter which interpretation you have. What matters is that you have an interpretation about Stevenson's wider purpose, what he wants the reader to believe. We have another bit of context now. Stephenson was an atheist, which is true, and it was likely that he was therefore against the church and used the novella as a means of highlighting the hypocrisy that existed in the Christian church. So, well, that's a really bold statement, a lovely one. What examples could you have to back up this view? Well, if you don't give any examples, you you simply can't get the credit for having this interesting idea. Stephenson would have been mindful at the time of writing not to offend the Christian church, who had all-encompassing power. He probably used setting by reference to abstract items such as weather and buildings to show the moral decay of society and the double life that many in the Christian church were living. Well, again, that is a really profound point, and you could prove it by linking to Jekyll's Christianity, or you could prove it with the Christian setting that I discussed in my plan with Utterson. However, none of that has anything to do with the setting, and the problem therefore, of course, is that you're not linking directly to the question. If you're not linking to the question, then you're not following the plan that builds an argument, remember? You're just including random points as you think, oh, here's another really important point I need to make about the novel because I know it's a good point. Well, yes, it is, but it's not a point that's getting you many marks because it's not linked to an argument that answers your question. Okay, let's look at the conclusion. The irony of the novella continues to the end when the battle of good and evil climax when Dr. Jekyll's only power to cut him off by suicide and bring the life of that unhappy Henry Jekyll to an end. That doesn't quite fully make sense. It's not a finished idea. Whilst light appears to have won, with Mr. Hyde dead, the Victorian reader would have known that to die by self-murder or suicide was to die alienated from God. That's very well written, very true. The irony being that the force of evil won with Jekyll dying an evil man, which you could say is also true. But it does reveal a misconception. It sounds as though you believe Dr. Jekyll has committed suicide and he's brought Henry Jekyll's life to an end by killing himself. But that is not actually what happens. What happens is that Hyde can turn into Hyde whenever he wants now, remember, and Jekyll needs the salts, the potion, in order to turn back into Jekyll. And as he reveals in his confession, he can only do that once more. He's writing the confession, finishing it, before he uses, before the last use of the drug is over. He then looks forward to his own death, not in a positive way, and that death will be when he now changes into Mr. Hyde and can no longer change back to Jekyll. That's why when Utterson and Poole discover the dead body, it's Hyde's body that they discover. Because Jekyll is lost forever, he's already changed into Hyde for the last time. And it's Hyde who commits suicide rather than be caught and executed as a murderer. Okay, the final problem with this otherwise really good conclusion is, again, it's not specifically linked to the setting and to your thesis. So that's how you can have a grade 7 understanding of the novel and grade 7 vocabulary and sentence construction, but still dramatically miss the grade 7 you deserve. And the cures are these 5 things, or I should say, one is like, these are the problems, aren't they? Sorry, not the cures. And the main cure that I've shown you is getting that planning done first. So my 3-minute plan would avoid all of those 5 errors. Now, if you've made it this far, why not write the essay? There's 10 points. You can pick the extract that was at the beginning, write the essay, and I'm convinced now that you'll be able to get at least a grade 7. Post it in the comments below for other people to comment on. You never know, I might take a look at it. And see you soon on my channel.